Anybody have any questions? In 1949, when the U.S. became aware of what had happened in China, it was a subject of great worry. Many of the same set of policymakers who had been chronicling the number of refugees, and they had the figures on it. They were talking about the figures that we're familiar with, feared that the refugee situation could lead, and they said, destabilization of the region unless it's resolved. So that was my connection. Everybody spoke the language of trusteeship, but how to do it was a very awkward question. Because first of all, there were people who thought, okay, we're in favor of trusteeship, but what this means is taking the whole Palestine question back to the General Assembly. There was some disagreement on that, because they figured that would open an awful lot of things that they were not prepared. So the same small group, I'm saying, they maybe were not ambivalent about using the word trusteeship, but they were ambivalent about what it would mean to implement it. Marshall was in favor of it. You know, he, at one point, Judah Magnus comes to Washington, and he was a frequent visitor, a man with no political influence, but sort of nice politics. And he sees everybody. And at some point he goes to see Marshall, and he tells Marshall, you know, I've lived in Jerusalem for I've lived there all my life, and I know how people feel. Everybody's sick of this situation. You know, and he tells him, you know, by the way, that the Jewish community that exists now, if it wasn't for American funding, would not exist. It would collapse, right? And he asked Marshall, do you think it would be possible to impose sanctions on Israel, right? And Marshall seems taken aback and says, let me think on that one. And you understand that the answer is going to be no, because that's going a little bit too far. But your last point, you see, I also was, in a way, shocked by the rapidity of the turnaround. But then I asked myself, why be shocked? In a way, I felt that U.S. officials were very impressed by the fact that the different Jewish militias, whom they identified as terrorist groups, the Irgun and Lehi, that they were capable of committing all kinds of acts that were tentatively disavowed by the Haganah, but then, in point of fact, the results accepted. That they violated various truce agreements without any repercussions. So they seemed, in some rude way, to get away with it. And then the upshot was both the CIA and the State Department and the military had figures. How many Palestinians? We'll talk about forces, right? And so they give you the numbers, Palestinian, Egyptian, Syrian, and they say Transjordan. Okay, Transjordan is the only country that has a sizable military, thanks to the British. But we don't know how long they can hold up. As far as the Egyptians, they have only the rotten equipment left by the British, so we can leave them out. So even though the numbers, the disparity in numbers is extraordinary, let's face it, the only ones with discipline, with training, with a sense of their goal and the ability to accomplish it, is this new small state. Seems impressive. And that's an element that goes into, well, anyway, what does it mean to talk about trusteeship when the State of Israel declares, when you have this Yishuv suddenly declaring itself unilaterally independent? So that there are a lot of there are a lot of internal opposing forces, and someone like Marshall. So Marshall is on the record as telling the Israelis, "How can you say you're not responsible for the refugees? We know what happened in Jaffa. We know what happened in Haifa. We have the numbers," and he says all of that. Then I discover, through Clark, so Clifford Clark. Clifford Clark leaked information. Clark Clifford, thanks. He leaked information. He leaked information about what he knew, what he had heard. One of the things that he heard, he claimed, was Marshall discovering that there were private talks, secret talks going on between Abdullah and Golda Meir and the Israelis. And he was reputed to have said, and this is what was reported, that if this was true, it would change how he felt. This is before the U.S. decides to drop its position and to recognize the inevitable. So there are soft spots in this. I mean, I give the impression that there's uniform hostility to partition, there's uniform demand for trusteeship, but obviously there are what I call soft spots within that suggest that there were some people who were not unalterably committed to these results. The impression I have, maybe subject to change by somebody else's research, is that the determining position was that of the military. But then when you see, I thought of this, and then I thought, well, what about my friend Max Ball? When Max Ball was having these discussions with Eliyahu Epstein, and Epstein was saying to him, at one point Epstein tells him, "What can we do for the U.S.?" That's really thinking ahead. And Ball is reputed to have said to him, "Well, you know, we understand that oil companies are thinking in terms of development projects in the Arab East. You might be able to help on that." Okay, this is, if it was so, you wonder where that led. But the fact is that here's Max Ball, who, by the way, shortly after he retires in 1948, he goes to Israel, and he becomes, he writes the first petroleum law for Israel. His son-in-law happens to become, who is a Palestinian Jew, he happens to become the first head of Delek, the Israeli oil company. It's through the connection with Max Ball that U.S. oil companies are invited to consider the possibilities of investigating whether the new state of Israel has any significant oil resources. So, look, there are a lot of threads to this thing. These talks are happening in different offices and different office buildings, but the people who are involved know each other. So if you have the person who is, but this is my speculation, so I say I'm open to correction on this. I'm arguing that somebody in the position of a figure like Max Ball, who is so close to the people in the world of oil, is able to, no doubt, not only discuss with Terry Deuce, who was then, vice president of Aramco, had been in the CIA, met with Eliyahu Epstein in Washington, was invited along with Charlie Harding, another oil executive, to meet with Epstein, and did after May 14th. Those encounters were surely not kept private. And if oil was the central concern of U.S. policymakers, shouldn't one then conclude, or at least speculate, that the evidence that, one, the major Arab oil producer would not take any action counter to U.S. oil concessions, and two, that there was evidence, in fact, that some of the major U.S. oil companies had a very pragmatic attitude towards the new state. They weren't running. Terry Deuce said to Max Ball, look, we have an agreement with the Saudis. We're not going to cross over into any Jewish-controlled territory. But let's wait until after the state is created. All right, so these are factors that may have contributed to the decision of the military people. There's something here that looks indeed very advantageous for us. In fact, the only negative is this refugee problem. So what happens in 1949? Truman appoints George McGee to be the head of a center, an institute in Washington, where the whole refugee question is shifted to Washington. It becomes an American concern in Washington. Only it's not just shifted, the language is transformed. It's now not a problem of refugees, it's a problem of development. It's not a political problem, it's no longer a national problem, it's a development problem. We can deal with that because we're specialists on development.
Hi, I just would ask for more detail about the premise of your book, because to me it seems like you sort of turn around the commonly believed proposition that it was either oil or Israel, but to me it's just like, I don't understand how supporting a Zionist state at this time would allow greater U.S. access to oil or better relations with its oil-producing neighbors.
Well, it's a good question, and when Truman became president, he repeated the same, the same story to Abdulaziz. Well, that was a nice declaration, and it had absolutely no meaning translated into policy. The fear was that, as I said before, if the U.S. supported a partition or a Zionist movement, it would lose the access to oil. And then it became evident that that wasn't going to be the case. Now, that's not a guarantee, after all. Oil was passing through pipelines. You could have had a tax. Timothy Mitchell would have a lot to say, of course, on the likelihood of that. But I'm saying that if that major element turns out to be questionable, the position that you describe, which is a common one, if that turns out to be questionable, then a lot of things open up.
So your premise is more that we can support Israel for all these other reasons and then not risk hurting our oil interests.
Well, look, if after May 48, the major U.S. oil companies in Saudi Arabia wanted to get access to what they thought might be interesting oil resources off the Gulf Coast, they weren't stopped, they were encouraged. The person who writes about this is Labelle in Diplomatic History. That's his letter. So our worries or our assumptions are perhaps misplaced, partially. No, it's a very good question. The answer is that many of the people in the State Department had a background in oil. So they're present. I mean, yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know that they were invited. Oil company representatives were invited in, but their interests were there.
So,
Well, so go ahead.
I think it's a very interesting point that you make about the military evaluation.
Yeah.
In other words, what they're saying is you can't argue with success. Now, isn't there a fine irony in the fact that, and we have, of course, a romanticized version of it, the fact that an American colonel, David Marcus, went to Israel to solidify those factions and make a strong army? Was there any evidence that you came across that perhaps his efforts were being thwarted at all, or was it well known? Could you talk to that for a few moments?
Yeah, I don't think that it made any difference. I mean, his case is well known. I didn't encounter in this literature an example of discussion of what impact it had. On the other hand, I've been reading a thesis coming out of Exeter on the relations between Canada and Palestine and Israel, in which the name of Marcus comes up as an example of an American, one American comparable to many more Canadians who went to fight in support of the creation of a Jewish state. In that case, the author argues that they made a difference, but I've not seen that. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there was a question you didn't answer I asked Tuesday. I wanted to stress a little bit about what you said about the U.S. worrying that Israel would be much closer to the Soviet Union than
Oh, yeah.
occurred. And on two levels. One level is the international relations aspect. The other is that I looked at your second or third chapter today before coming, and you mentioned strikes, that there were some strikes in Palestine and some of the Arab countries where there was Arab-Jewish solidarity. So I'm wondering how much you feel it was a factor, because surely they knew that Ben-Gurion and the leadership is very pro-Western and wouldn't be talking about. I'm just curious as to how important.
But there was a concern that groups like the Stern Gang were sympathetic to the Soviet Union. And they're repeatedly mentioned, and the fear, allied to that, there's people in the Department of State remarking on the question, can the government in Israel control its various so-called dissident groups? Yeah, the point you raise is important. That is to say, is part of the decision-making at the end and the turn. There was this question. Yes, looking back in hindsight, it appears evident that Ben-Gurion would be supportive of the West. But Ben-Gurion was also grateful to the Soviet Union, as were many supporters of the Zionist movement. And later, Israel won the Soviet Union supported partition and then supported recognition. There were also many
And the weapons.
began. Well, the weapons were coming from Czechoslovakia, right. But there were also Jews in the Soviet Union that Ben-Gurion and others mentioned as a matter of concern. Therefore, there was a desire to maintain good relations. Translated on the American side, all of this was, yeah, a source of worry. And although Epstein becomes the first ambassador, Israeli ambassador to the U.S., and he and others point out, after all, the U.S. has a sizable Jewish population. What's the reason for worry? That didn't go over very far in terms of the policy-making group. So they wanted something more concrete than that. There were also some people on the Israeli side who were interested in a NATO-like organization for which there was no support. But yes, it's an important point. Look, I downplay the role of the Cold War that many people have argued is the proper context in which to see this. That's something, yeah, I own up to deliberately. Yeah. Anyone else?
One more question.
I believe you mentioned it in your book, but the scare of all of the Jews that had been displaced in World War II coming to the United States.
Yeah.
I agree with what you. I think that was a very strong factor in let's give them somewhere else to go because we don't really want them here. And the other, you know, when you're talking about the Soviet Union, a lot of the settlers, the Jewish settlers from the early 1900s who were living in Palestine were very much socialists.
Mm-hmm.
So they weren't necessarily communists, but that could be part of that scare.
You know, with respect to the first point, I think that the circumstances that led to the Harrison report are important because, look, this is happening in 1945. So it's happening in the wake of the events of the Holocaust. And Truman gets reports saying that the Americans in the American zone, the American occupied zone of Germany, are treating Jews as badly as, almost as badly as were the Nazis. You've got to look into this. He appoints eventually Harrison to look into it. The report he sends is devastating. The report he sends is indeed that conditions are terrible, and he has all kinds of interesting recommendations about how that are sent to Eisenhower, who's in charge, that one ought to single out the Jewish refugees from others. They should have access to housing in Germany itself, and our first obligation is to figure out where they want to go. As you probably know, there are many studies on this question, and in fact on where refugees wanted to go, plus what the immigration laws were of various countries in this period. So the immigration laws in the U.S. were infamous from this perspective. Yeah, the solution, why not send them to Palestine? And it was often presented as Palestine is a place to which refugees wish to go. All this stuff is too serious just to lay out casually without evidence. I simply want to reiterate your point. It was a very major consideration. So this is happening in 45. It's also in 45 that you get some of the first statements from the State Department saying the Palestine conflict is going to be one of the most important conflicts we have to deal with. I mean, perhaps in retrospect, that is that's the most shocking thing, given the current attitude, that here in this, in this formative period, there was a recognition that, first of all, it was considered highly unlikely that the conflict would end as it did, even if even if, let's say, the Joint Chiefs and others concluded that the Israeli military represented the number 2 military power after Turkey in the Middle East. This is 1949. It's impressive at the time. They admitted that they were not at all sure that Israel would emerge from the struggle over Palestine as it did. So they were surprised and had a sense of what the number of casualties were as well. Now, when you read this literature, it's not exactly reading the equivalent of, let's say, what's his name, Yitzhar Smilansky, who wrote Yobet Hizeh, right? That was published in May 49. This is an Israeli who was, yes, there it is, right. Oh, strange, there it is, yeah. This important book on how, published in May 49 by an Israeli who had been involved in the conquest of land, Palestinian land, and subsequent expulsion of Palestinians. Maybe Thomas Wasson, his reports from Deir Yassin were perhaps the equivalent with Robert McAtee. So there's a human dimension there too. Any other questions? So let me invite, for those of you who haven't asked questions but who would like to do so when you leave, please feel free to be in touch with me via email. So it's my name at BU.edu, and I'll be happy to respond.
Thank you.
Thank you.
They loved it.
Well,